Okay, now let's try to get that screen back up. Okay, what are you seeing now? Just the WebEx thing? Or are you seeing basically?
Your Word document.
Okay, good. This is what we're going to go through. I actually don't know how to look at both this and you. Wait a minute. We have to sort that out so I can see if you raise your hand. Uh, I guess I'll just have to put it over top. Okay, I can see if you raise your hand, but you can also just say things. Okay, here we go. Page 176 on mine, which is the first page of the chapter. You don't need to follow along in your book, but if you want to, that's where we are. This is the one that, it says the role of evolution, the role of words in cultural evolution, and it starts with that quote from Charles Darwin. Okay, now this is where I really do want you guys to interrupt me and ask questions because it's where he's going to jump right into this analogy between cultural things and linguistic things and biological things, which is the big stretch. Okay, words like viruses are relatively simple things compared with organisms and religions, for instance, that don't just wax and wane, like the oxygen level in the atmosphere or like trust. They replicate, they have offspring. Okay? Now, when I first
Okay.
read that, I said, oh,
Sorry,
okay, yeah,
doctor. Can you let Terim in because she left by accident?
okay, thanks.
Okay. Also, a question.
Yes,
So it's exactly about when he says that words like reproduce or
replicate. Yeah. This is,
replicate. Sorry.
that's why I made a note here. No, don't be sorry. It's the same thing. Reproduce and replicate are the same. Um, but yeah, I knew that this would be something that it puzzled me. So yeah, so when your question is when he says this, what does he mean, or you have an objection, or what?
No, I'm just like I don't really understand how words can replicate like as, you know, an entity, but okay. I'll just listen
Okay,
to this. Okay.
yeah, yeah, good. So um, this is where his notion between the type and this, well, it's a lot of people's notion, but this notion between the type and the token, right? You need to think of individual instances of a word type, uh, like, well, let's see. In the page we're looking at here, we got the title. There's the word words there, and then the subtitle, evolution of words, and then he says words. So there's all these uh, uses of that. So right in this case, um, okay, this is going to be weird, but I'm going to try it. By writing this book and uh, having it be interesting enough to me, and me having a situation where I'm teaching graduate students, the word, the word type is getting a lot of tokens of itself. The tokening of word, right?
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
so, so let's play a little bit around with the type token distinction, right? So we all like if you're playing chess, there's this notion of the chess player plus chess piece type. That's the king, right? And we describe that by talking about well, the king. There's two important things about it. If you get it taken, you lose the game. And second, it can only move one direction, one space, so it's very slow, right? But then each time somebody makes a chess set, you come up with an individual tokening of that king, right? And so and this is one of the interesting and tricky parts. Um, the token, sorry, the type is an abstract thing. That notion of king in a chess game that we think of abstractly as being governed by certain kinds of rules is abstract, whereas the actual physical tokenings, the wooden or ivory or whatever pieces, are physical, right? So that's one thing. And okay. Um, so far so good, Pia?
Sorry, did you ask a question? I
I
couldn't
just
hear
said so
you.
far so good. Is this helping at all understand what he means by replicate?
Yes, yes, yep, it's way
Yeah.
clearer. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay. Words, I will argue, are the best example of memes, culturally transmitted items that evolve by differential replication, that is, by natural selection. So here again, he's applying this method, natural selection, to uh, cultural units and in particular linguistic units. Okay. We, Homo sapiens, are the only species so far with richly cumulative culture. And the key ingredient in culture that makes this possible is language. I take it that's pretty self explanatory. And this is what I was anticipating before. We and our chickens, cows, and pigs have taken over the planet. Since 1800, our population has increased sevenfold. And this is important. Our genes haven't changed very much in the last 50,000 years. Um, yeah, we're so the point there is it's not because of things that are changing in terms of genetic structure that's making us more and more successful and allowing us to reproduce like this. It's something else. Okay. One of the facts of life, both generic and cultural, is that options become obligatory. Okay. So here the idea is going to be that culture becomes something that one has to embrace with culture and language. Um, there are a few, although I don't think there's any examples, but there's a few, no, that human beings that don't have means of communicating with each other and means of passing knowledge on between generations just don't exist anymore. Okay, this is what does it mean for something that's an option, or at one point we might have thought was optional, becomes obligatory. And he goes through a couple examples. So all primates, no, yeah, all primates, um, all animals have their own way of. Okay, I'm sorry. Most primates have ways of making vitamin C in their body. Chimpanzees, and this is why chimpanzees are at risk if they ever lose their sort of tropical habitats, mostly in Borneo now, in parts of Africa, where they need to get the fruit, will not be able to survive because they have to get vitamin C. And another one he talks about is, cell phones and credit cards used to be luxuries for the rich or just people with disposable income. And now you kind of can't function without them. And cash is probably going to go away. That's actually already happening in China. Even if you buy like a bit of street food, like a potato dumpling, you put your phone up and the street vendor puts their phone up, boop, and you pay them, some tiny amount of money, 50 cents or something, for the dumpling, and then you go. So it becomes, and I believe me, I tried to fight against the smartphone thing for decade, or a decade maybe, and eventually you can't do it. Okay, so now. And the fact is, that's going to be applied to languages too. Words certainly play a central and ineliminable role in our explosive cultural evolution. And inquiring into the evolution of words will serve as a feasible entry and the daunting questions about cultural evolution and its role in shaping our minds. Okay, so that's why we're doing it. Okay. The idea that languages evolve, that words are, and that is not that new languages come up here, but just that within a language it changes, right? The idea that languages evolve, that words today are descendants in some fashion of words in the past, is actually older than Darwin's theory of the origin of species. Philologists and paleographers work on Homer's Iliad, right? I think you guys probably know this. Homer's Iliad was originally a song that was or a tale that was told by bards. This was a job in the ancient world. You could walk around and be the guy or gal who told the story of the Iliad, and it takes a week like to say the thing. You show up in the town, you say it, and then you get paid for it, and that's it. And as a side note, Plato was really worried about the development of writing and books. He thought maybe that we would, just like now people worry about our attention spans going away because of the internet. Plato was worried that our capacity for memory would go away if we didn't need to memorize stories that took a week to tell. So, um, and there's some other examples. Beowulf is one where you look at it and it's unintelligible to current speakers of the language that's written in, whether it's Greek or uh, English for Beowulf. And then they basically contract through the changes and come up with a version that is understandable to us. So that's just as an example of the fact that these do change over time. Okay. Some of the latest bioinformatic techniques used today to determine relationships between genomes. This is the kind of work that people like Rabia Talhouk and others in the biology department do. Bioinformatic techniques used today to determine relationships between genomes and themselves refined descendants of techniques developed to trace patterns of errors, mutations in ancient texts. Okay, now let's just talk a little. Do we lose Reem again? We did lose Reem again. Just a second. Let me text her.
Sorry, I disconnected. I'm back.
Oh, so Reem's trying to restart because her audio's out. Okay. I'm not seeing the clue for inviting people.
By the way, is Muhammad in the lobby because he needs to be let in?
I'm not. Okay. It just says not in the meeting. Now, where is that? People, I don't. I'm just looking for that notice for people are in the lobby. Let them in. Oh, there are people waiting in the lobby. Okay, now we're getting it. Hello, Mohammed. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, I
Okay.
can hear it. Sorry for being late.
No, I understand. Okay. So, and by the way, the part that we covered in the first half an hour or 45 minutes, I guess, is recorded, so you can go back and look at that later. Um, when I get to think. So, I guess what one of the things we should go ahead and try is to stop the video. Maybe that'll keep the audio from cutting out. Reem's joining us from Virginia in the U.S., so who knows what she's dealing with. So let's cut video and see how it goes. Okay. Now, um, this is where I wanted to press these. So one of the things, Mohammed, that we've been talking about is this is one of the chapters where we really see this attempt by Dennett to extend the explanatory method of natural selection, traditionally understood in terms of speciesization and biology, to other parts of the world that we want to understand, and in particular in language and words. Now, so here's one where he says, look, Dennett says, some of the latest bioinformatic techniques used today to determine how genomes work are themselves defined descendants of techniques developed by philologists and what he calls paleologists, not well, paleology people who work on words, language. They treat patterns of errors in replication, that is mutation. So that's one part of this metaphor. And I want to make sure everybody kind of gets that and sees why it's might be useful. So he's saying, look, the way that philologists understand, like, so one of these famous debates is there's a when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a challenge to this notion that what happened was when the Israelites left Egypt, that God parted the Red Sea and really just made a hole between two walls of water, and people walked out. And that notion of parting was because that's an English word, but the word in Hebrew, I guess, that was coming from uh, was they thought mistranslated, and that what actually was, it was a part came in. So basically, an earthquake happened. So while the Egyptians were chasing the Israelites as they were trying to flee, it was an earthquake, right? And that was a whole debate. Seems a little bit more plausible from a natural point of view than the sea. But that's that kind of idea, that method of looking for errors in replication is very similar to looking for mutations in the development of, so that thing of looking for errors in replication of texts is very similar, and so similar that we can use it as instructive to understand how it is that speciesizations happens. We use that method from philology to apply to the science of genes. So that's just one part. So again, with the note toward realizing that some people are just brand new to the conversation, we're just trying to both get comfortable with, or just recognize the ambition of this attempt to use evolution by natural selection as the explanatory model for all this range of phenomenon. Okay, I hope that was clear, and I hope people were able to hear it with the audio doing what it does. Are there any questions or comments or reactions about that? This notion of applying stuff we learned in studying language to genetic theory, and that sort of strengthening the analogy between these two, which are strengthening the case for using one explanatory method in both realms. Does that make sense? Or at least you follow what point we're trying to make?
So far, all is good from my side.
Isn't it circular?
It doesn't strike me on the face of it as circular. Say more about what you're worried about.
So you are assuming that there is a link to strengthen the analogy.
Well, it's more. He's at this point he's just doing history of science. He's saying when you look at the tools that geneticists use, I mean, I think there's a documented historical pattern to this, that attempt to go back and try to see where errors happen and what those errors led to is in fact in use. Not that this is just a speculation that might strengthen it, but in fact, he's saying it's already the case that genetic scientists use a method that was first developed by philologists to try to figure out. So, right, for instance, understanding how that debate happened with whether it's an earthquake or a parting of the sea came to a typographical. Somebody was recopying the text, and the one that ended up in most of the versions that got copied over and became the King James version and Luther's German in England was based on a mistake. That's the idea. So it's not really part of an argument yet. He's just drawing out the analogy, but you certainly can have that as a concern as we move forward too. And again, I'm not trying to convince you that this is all works from the get-go. I'm just trying to explain A, what the move is, and B, just kind of how ambitious it is, and that it really is a new project. And that's why we're reading this book. That nobody's really pushed the case this hard before. Okay, so fair
Yeah.
concern, Ali, but I don't think we really have an issue here yet of circularity. Any other thoughts people have? Mohammed, do you feel like you're following the conversation since you missed last week and I was too dumb to get the old recording up? Or what we're saying so far makes sense?
To be honest, not so much.
Okay,
I'll try to pick up
Okay.
after the end of the class.
that makes sense. Okay, so we'll keep an eye on you as we go. Okay, now let's look more closely at the case of words. What are words? And here's this issue that came up in response to Pia's question before. We need to note this type token distinction, just so we have a clear way of talking about this. Okay, here's one way, just an example to draw it out. Word, in quotes, that's a mention, not a use. Word is a word, and there are three tokens of that word in this sentence. Okay. And again, one of the things that we anticipated in our discussion before is that the individual tokens of a word, whether it's spoken and it involves sound waves, and in our context, it gets digitized and then analogized, if that's a word, at the other end through this WebEx program, or if it's a written thing, or if it's there's any different ones, but those are physical things in the world. But the type, the I guess for lack of a better word, the concept of word is not a physical thing. It's a thing that's an abstract entity that we understand in terms of its grammar, its definition, the fact that it's a noun, although it can be used expressive and somebody uses it to agreement, like word. Like I agree, right? But first and foremost, it's a noun and all that. So we have abstract entities that then have physical instantiations. So that's the first notion of seeing this here, and it's going to be different because DNA code is physical and words are not in that way. Okay. As we go along in the discussion, he notes that there is an obvious fact. This is on page 185, which I don't know where it is in your text, unfortunately. Okay, there's an obvious fact that in addition to public tokens of words, there are private internal tokens of words. And we should notice the much less obvious fact. So this is idea, right? So when you try to say, wait a minute, what was that term we were thinking about? And you go, yeah, you say it to yourself or it goes through your mind or whatever. That's different than the public token, private internal tokens of words. But there's a much less obvious fact that we don't yet know anything about their physical properties. Internal tokens seem to resemble external tokens, but this is because they make use of the very same neural circuitry we use to detect the resemblance and differences between external tokens, not because this neural circuitry renders copies of what it identifies. Okay, so what he's talking about here is in this method of thinking about this, and when people sort of introspect about words, because he's going to be arguing against some assumptions he thinks most of his readers have that he thinks are definitely false and probably problematic and get in the way of understanding these things correctly. When we think, oh, I'm trying to think of that word, okay, we have to need a different one than word. It's just getting confusing. So the name of the place where you go and there's sand by the sea, it's playa in Spanish, and you go beach, right? Beach. And for a second, right when you try to remember that word, it feels kind of BEACHE, right? You get this sense that something just went through your mind that had letters in it, and you might think, oh, that's a physical phenomenon, right? And he says that feels like that, but we're wrong about that it is like that. And this is one of the things that I picked up on and wanted to emphasize from that video that PS circulated, that podcast with a video component, where he was talking about that when you take science seriously, you have to tell people that our access to our conscious experience is not infallible or incorrigible. Sometimes we're wrong. And this is one of those. He says that because we use the same part of our brain, or the same circuitry is more important than part, the same circuitry to try to recall a word as we do when we're looking at a new word in a text and saying, oh yeah, that means beach, that means by the sea. That because those are both there, it feels like there's letters in our internal tokening of beach, say, but there isn't. There are no letters. There is no sort of physicalness to it. It's just something different. Okay. So again, that's just emphasizing the case that there aren't physical analogs in these tokens of the in the internal tokens that there are in the external ones. Okay. And again, please stop me when this gets confusing or you just want to say, what the hell? Okay. 46. Oh. When he goes through this, no, I think it's actually 47 we're talking about. Yeah. It may be helpful to imagine that if you it may help to imagine this if you compare the phenomenon to Shazam, the smartphone app that can identify music playing on the radio. The signal transduced by the microphone doesn't have to get turned back into sounds in order to be identified by the program. That is, when are trying to remember a term, and we remember, oh yeah, that term is beach. It is not necessary for that term to get tokened in physical medium the way that it is when we look at it on the page, or when we even hear the term beach, right? And when you imagine that you're sort of saying it out loud, you sort of have to go, yeah, okay, the beach. It feels for all the distance like it just that you even hear the sound. So there's another one. You don't hear the sound inside your own brain. Right? That's that notion of Cartesian theater he was talking about before, where there's this tendency to try to build in pointless redundancy. We're like, oh, well, what it is to remember a term is to see it tokened in the mind's eye, in your brain. Oh, there's beach, or a picture of a beach, say. That's all that stuff about Cartesian theater, where we have this tendency to try to reproduce the phenomenon of interacting in the world and say, well, that's going on in my brain. And he says, well, first of all, that's redundant. Once you've recognized the thing, you've recognized the thing. You don't need to replay it in your brain, but we have a tendency to think of it like that. Now, he's sort of, at this point in the text, he's sort of assuming you've gone along with the exercises, the sort of mental exercises he's asked you to do, and say these things to yourself and try to recall it. And he's sort of betting that you'll have this tendency to think of it as a physical tokening in the brain or the mind's eye, and he's trying to correct against that. Okay? Questions? Press on. Okay. Next page. What makes something a token of a type is not a simple resemblance at all. The written token cat and the sound you make when you read it aloud are both tokens of the type cat and don't resemble each other at all. And I think it's useful also to push this next point. Other examples of modes in which we can say cat with cat in scare quotes. Braille, right? That the dotted thing that Henry? No, what's her name? Helen Keller, the one of the first blind people in the history of the world, actually, to go all the way through university education, developed a system where you could, and you'll see them on elevators sometimes, right next to the 7, there'll be a sequence of dots that represent 7 in the Braille alphabet. And ASL, American Sign Language, right, where you kind of can, I actually know one. It's only one I know. Just means get in the car. When your kid's not paying attention and you want them they say get in the car. And there's this is Rochester, New York. Rochester Institute of Technology has one of the biggest places to educate blind people and deaf people, so that's why I know that one. Oh, and that's our, well, anyway, so yeah, that's another example. Different physical instantiation, but it goes back to the same word. Morse code, right? You can say that in cat. Morse code is just alphabetical. Each letter is assigned a certain thing. I think the one most people know is SOS, for rescue, save our ship. It goes, it's either whether you do it quick or slow. It goes dot 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 dash 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 dot 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 dash dash dash. That means SOS, and that translates back into save our ship. And those are just beeps that you hear. So the point we're emphasizing here, and this is the point you've come across if you took Introduction to Logic, when people emphasize the difference between propositions and sentences. These word types, again, are abstract entities that we understand in terms of their syntactic and semantic roles in the language, and they have absolutely no resemblance, nothing similar at all to the physical tokens that we have, either a sound, cat, or the written words, CAT, or how Braille ever does it. So there's the idea. We've got this abstract entity that is the well, one of the things we need to explain if we understand how these things change in through the development of a human being. Okay. Any process that makes a new token of a type from an existing token of a type counts as replication. So this is a partial answer to Pia's concern before. This is the sense in which it replicates itself, whether or not tokens are physically identical or even similar. So so anytime that word gets put into Braille, gets put into Morse code, gets put into ASL, that's a replication, and it exists again. And for that's one thing, and this is a weird artifact of history and sort of I guess the power of the American Research University model. People, and this is kind of amazing when you think about it, deaf people learn English in order to be able to speak sign language, because the only one that's been systemized out is ASL, American Sign Language. So that's an extra burden to be put on them. But what it also means is that's the community. There's an there's an ASL speaking community in the world that then you can then communicate with, right? You maybe have been seeing it in these recent things on international news with all these hurricanes in the U.S. Right next to the governor who's explaining what people should do, there's somebody signing so that deaf people also know they should, get out of town before the hurricane hits or something. Okay. So here's one attempt to say it. Words are, we might say, made of information. So you've got a unit of information that manages to replicate itself into physical tokenings by being passed around through brains, and then people won't write it or say it. Okay. Of the analogy making sense, this analogy between explaining the persistence of words over time versus the job of explaining biological traits over time. Everybody on board?
Yes.
Was that Pia who said that?
No, we.
Oh, good. Thank you. It's hard for me. You guys' voices kind of sound the same. Ali, you with us? You can put it in the chat
Yeah.
if you.
Yeah.
Good. Mohammed, you good with this?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, guys. Okay. Now this is a weird side thing he goes on. So there's I think it's worth discussing this, the dispute between Millikan, Kaplan, and Dennett, who tried to put evolution into this explanation. Ruth Millikan, by the way, is the woman's name. She came to one of our conferences. Kaplan is a guy at UCLA. I forget what his name. Mike, maybe. Anyway, and then Noam Chomsky and Bromberger have two different views about that. For various reasons, Chomsky and the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy of Language at MIT is the place where modern linguistics got started. Okay. This is Bromberger's take. He says, people changed, not words. If they're abstract, one of the other ways he put it is if they're abstract entities, how do they change? The idea is, change happens because of physical forces in the causal forces in the physical world, and that's how you get things to change. You can't do that to abstract entities. Now, what this is going to suggest is, for lack of a better word, a kind of Platonic account of words, that the tokens, sorry, exactly the opposite. The types of words exist in some way that's analogous to Plato's forms. They're there, they're eternal, and then sometimes some humans go by and then they have a manifestation of the form that becomes a tokening. This is Dennett's accusation, that's the picture that the linguists following Chomsky are laboring under. And here's a good way of trying to explain that. Okay, we'll get back to that. There's a thing about Socrates that I will come up shortly. Okay, so here's again pushing this analogy. A word, like a virus, is a minimal kind of agent. An agent, just in this case, it's not a moral agent or anything like that. It just means an entity that can be properly understood as having a goal. It wants to get itself said. And then he footnotes himself, which is a little cheesy, but it says, why? Because if it doesn't, it will go extinct. A word is selfish in exactly the same way a gene is selfish. Now, he concedes that this is an analogy or a metaphor. Obviously, the word doesn't sit around and think, I better get reproduced. But he thinks it's a very useful understanding the fact that there are words that are still around, as those are ones that successfully replicated. So that's the point. Okay. An informational thing doesn't have a mind, of course, any more than a virus does. But like a virus, it is designed by evolution mainly to provoke and enhance its own replication. Every token it generates is one of its offspring. How do words reproduce? And this is the longest section of the chapter. The sounds of specific words become more and more familiar, recognizable, identifiable. Oh, this is infant development, sort of stuff that Tom Armin works on. The sounds of specific words become more and more familiar, recognizable, identifiable as the repetitions pile up in both uttering and hearing. A pronounceable word has taken up residence in the infant's brain, and at this point it is good for nothing but reproducing itself. Soon it begins to acquire uses discernible unconsciously by the infant, and gradually it begins to mean something to the child. So now we'll go through this process and the analogy he uses between evolution of genes and evolution of words, and we'll kind of go through it, and then you'll tell me which part of it you understand and what parts you don't. Which processes of language acquisition are conscious and which are unconscious is a question a theorist might ask. And then it basically is going to say, well, it's blurry, and there's things that are sort of conscious. But here we go. Some people cling to the view that consciousness is the big exception to gradualism, a phenomenon we see all over nature, right? There's, it's that chicken or the egg thing is a parody, right? There's going to be intermediate species between whatever dinosaur chickens were developed from, and chickens that are sort of chicken-like. And it's sort of silly to say that there's a chicken that's all gotten more and more chicken-like, and it's still evolving and changing and all that. But he says he wants to say that consciousness is like that too. There's some things that are conscious. There's some things that are clearly conscious. There's some things that are clearly not conscious, and there's a whole slew of things in the continuum between those things. Some people will cling to the view that consciousness is the big exception to gradualism, an all or nothing property that divides the universe into two utterly disjoint classes. Those things that it is like to be something, and those that it is not like to be something. Tom Nagel, and that's from What It's Like to Be a Bat. John Searle in, I'm trying to remember the name of that book. Oh, well, no, actually, that you can also see that in the Chinese room argument. David Chalmers, The Conscious Mind, and Colin McGinn about intentionality, his book's called. I've never encountered a persuasive argument for why this should be so. So let's stop and think about that a little bit. What do people think about the suggestion by people like Chalmers, Searle, McGinn, and Nagel, very smart philosophers, people who made lots and lots of progress in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of language, that they say, look, consciousness is like or conscious awareness, we might say, is like a switch. It's either on or off. There's some stuff that you're definitely aware of, and I think they're going to stand on the position that only human beings have this. Only adult, competent users of language and concepts can be conscious, and when they're conscious, it's on, and the times when they're not conscious, like when they're asleep or when they're processing things subconsciously, it's off. A lot of people have found that view the right one, or at least intuitive or sympathetic? What do you think? Is consciousness something that it's clear where this comes from, right? It's from the tradition from Descartes, where he says, the fact that I am conscious of a thing means I exist. Clear consciousness is what it is to be existing, and when you're not, then your existence is not provable, say. Any thoughts? You can put it in the chat if you want, but I just want to know if this seems. Dennett is setting this up as his opponent. Lots of people have found this view plausible, and some people even find it obvious. Searle is one in particular, which I wrote about in the article I sent you guys. Which side seems right to you? Are we sort of conscious of some things, or is it yes or no? Yeah, Mohammed.
To me, it feels just we're like jumping from the word conscious, which is a bit ambiguous or unclear, into awareness. So being conscious is being aware of certain stuff, but also the question comes, what is being aware at some stuff? What is being, so we're just defining consciousness using awareness. To me, it doesn't help that much.
Okay, well, I mean, as you said, consciousness is ambiguous. So let's look. So here's one. I don't know. You can call it conscious or aware or not. The power just went out here. It probably happened to other people. And when it did, I noticed that. Let me put it this way. I noticed that the air conditioner had been on before the power went out. The lights went out. That's obvious. I have lights on because it's a little bit dark in this corner of the room. But I was not, I would argue that I was not aware of the air conditioning being on. I wasn't sort of hearing it. I wasn't feeling the cool air blow on me. But, okay, I don't want to give away the answer I'm looking for. But then when that stopped, I noticed. I was like, oh, that's no longer happening. So what's that phenomenon? Isn't that a case of it moving from
Competence to comprehension.
what to comprehension?
Are we going to say competence to comprehension again?
I don't think the C words here are going to do it. It's look, it's I don't think any of you guys wear glasses. One of the examples I like to do with students is if I say, notice the frames of the glasses in your field of vision, right? You scan that, you because it's just distracting to think about it. You filter it out. But when somebody says, do you notice that that's there? You go, of course, yeah, I see them. And another one, are your feet warm enough that there's a little bit of sweat on the soles of your feet on the bottom? Now you have an answer, yes or no. So your body, you're at some level, your brain's paying attention to that stuff, right? Because it needs to know, like if all of a sudden your foot's in boiling water, or something else goes on, like it's so slippery it's so wet you might slip and fall, it comes into consciousness. But that's the idea, and this is where I think then it just has to be right, and Searle just has to be wrong. That there's all kinds of this brain paying attention to what's going on in your body, but your conscious, your awareness can't be bothered to be pay attention to it, because then otherwise we'd never be able to focus enough to have confusing conversations like this one, right? We all the time have a bunch of stuff going on that our brain's paying attention to, and it's we're I don't know. Are we gonna have to go for competence? We're taking in information about it, but at some level, non-conscious decision is being made to not bother our conscious part of to not bother our awareness with it. And now all this stuff is confusing because we got this, but that's it. I just want you to take that, the possibility that one of those might be right and one of them might be wrong seriously, and realize that the majority position in the philosophy of mind is that consciousness is either on or off. That there isn't and that's what makes humans unique. And this was the whole point of the distinction between original and derived intentionality. Remember that silly example we had of the ants that made the bas-relief sand sculpture of Winston Churchill's face? That when a conscious adult human being with language and knowledge of history comes along and says, "Oh, look at that! It's Winston Churchill." Now all of a sudden that's in consciousness, and before it wasn't, right? And so that's the kind of distinction that Searle and McGinn used to try to drive a wedge and say, like, look, there's clearly an on and off there. Before it was just stuff. And for the whole rest of the world, the whole non-human world, there's just stuff. And this is the model that Dennett's trying to break down and say, wait, what are you talking about? All over the planet, there's, even at the level of bacteria, he wants to try to convince us, there's organisms paying attention to their environment and taking actions based on what the affordances there are there. And that he says you're just never going to understand what minds are unless you take that seriously, that there's all this sort of consciousness floating around, and to think of it as either or is a mistake. That's the debate I want you to be aware exists. Okay. Any thoughts? Anybody? Okay. Yeah. That's not. I have never encountered a perspective. So he goes on and says he thinks it's a leftover. You know the story of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's one. The when he put together the body of Frankenstein. No, he's Dr. Frankenstein. So he put together the story, the monster of parts. He dug up parts from the graveyard, and then he shot electricity through it, and it became alive. And then it says this idea to think that consciousness is on or off is a weird descendant of that now discredited 19th century notion of the what was it called? Basically the animate force that there's a little switch that goes on that makes dead matter live matter, and it shuts off when we die. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the language side of the argument. Today, the installation of a native language in a human infant is a well-designed process, benefiting, no doubt, from the selective impacts on thousands of generations of human language learners. Many shortcuts may have been developed by evolutionary processes along the way, making languages easier to acquire, words easier to pronounce, and recognize assertions and questions and requests and commands easier to formulate and express. These evolutionary processes would not initially have involved differential replication of genes, but rather the much swifter differential replication of memes. Now, this is a key claim. language evolved to fit the human brain before the brain evolved to better accommodate language. Now, I get that everybody's tired and there's lots of things to be distracted about and it's hard to focus. But this is a pretty amazing claim that I bet you, like me, had never thought of the possibility of before. So, what do you think of this claim that language evolved to fit the human brain before the brain evolved to better accommodate language? One level is just counterintuitive. It looks like it's impossible to work in that historical order. But that's where you're going to get your sorta operator. There were sorts of communications going on that were not part of a fully developed, what we would call like a natural language, like Arabic or English or German or whatever. But it was getting, the communication was getting its way into the brain and then became a candidate for use in the brain the way that our brains use language now. So let's just do a quick vote on chat. How many people think it's false, or probably false, or you would bet it's false to say that language evolved to fit the brain before the brain evolved to better accommodate language? Put it in the chat. Go ahead, Reem.
I'm just gonna type it in.
Okay.
I don't quite get the part where language evolves to fit the brain. How would language evolve? Isn't the evolution of language is part of the evolution of brains? I don't get it quite. Like language
The
evolved to
idea.
fit the brain. Yeah.
Okay, so there were predecessors of what we would now call a full-blown natural language with syntax and semantics and all the rest of it. Ways of communicating. Think with like other species, the way that dolphins use beeping in order to communicate, and that other animals use certain kind of shrieks to signal that danger's coming, right? That's a kind of communication going on. And certainly in the evolution of Homo sapien and other hominids, that kind of a communication went on. But the idea is at some point, that kind of communication developed into something that was sophisticated enough that it could be used like we use language in the brain, and it had to be selected for. So, you know, think about all these analogies where he uses the software analogy or computer science, where he's talking about you have to be able to differentiate the noise from the actual information. So in a population, you're going to have of animals, you're going to have all kinds of squeaking going on, but every once in a while, you're going to want to pick up on the squeak that is meaningful, and that means like there's a wolf coming down the trail, and we're a bunch of whatever, the marmots, and the wolves like to eat marmots, so you got to get out, right? So that things that you wouldn't call, so that's again, we've got to stretch our notions. We wouldn't call these things language, but candidates for communications and salience developed and had to develop in ways that our brains could use. And it had to go in that order, as opposed to our brains sort of being here and saying, well, not saying, that's dumb, but brains sort of, as part of human development, sort of prepared a fertile ground for language to come into it. So, yeah. Huh? Pia probably false, Reem false. So I think this is probably, I think those reactions are probably based on I think this is the suspicion Muhammad was getting at, but it was also when I was trying to describe it, what I ran into, that when you say language, it sounds like, well, no, that a fully developed language could only exist in a human brain. So what are you even talking about? So, but the idea is that there's something like a system of communication, or maybe a system of cooperation or something. Nah, it's very hard stuff to think about.
The problem for me is that we're saying language evolved, but isn't the brain selecting for certain words? Like, yeah, it's evolving, but isn't the brain the one doing the selecting in that case? Like when certain words go out of, like go extinct. Is it like maybe the brain selected language in a way to fit it better?
Well, right. But I mean, the, the brain is not the ultimate level where this happens, right? Because the brain is is part of us, and we're embedded in an Umwelt where there's affordances, right? So, for instance, I'm trying to think. So, at some point, human beings needed a capacity to deal with the dangers of saber-toothed tigers. And then the saber-toothed tigers, those were around while there were people. But then there wasn't writing. Nobody was writing about, oh, my great battle against the saber-toothed tiger, and oh, the best meat's in the rump if you're going to eat a saber-toothed tiger, or any of that sort of stuff. It just sort of went away when they went extinct. And then when people found fully intact bodies of saber-toothed tigers in the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, and oh, they found more and more. Then we needed to come up with new words to refer to this thing. And of course, the whatever the heck the Neanderthals or the pre-hominid humans, maybe, probably, called it, didn't sound anything like saber-tooth tiger. They didn't know what a saber was, of course. We know a saber is a curved sword, so we call it, because it has curved teeth, we call it a saber-tooth tiger. So the idea is just, so it isn't that the brain is by itself sort of sitting there going like, well, I like this word, I like that word. It's going to be embedded in a biological environment, and then also he thinks later of a social environment, right, where you realize pretty quick that once you are able to say, I don't know, mommy, you're going to get help that you want. I'm just reading Ali's comment here. Maybe the better claim to make is that language being co-evolving culturally with the human brain right at the same time, when the brain's biological evolution permitted the existence of. Okay, yeah, good. These are exactly the kind of things I want you to think
Can
about.
I-
And I don't expect anyone.
Can I
Go ahead,
just have a
Mohammed.
question? Because it's kind of interesting to me, this idea. I don't know if I'm getting it correct, but it's bringing me to what sellers have to say about language, about how. Okay, so what I understood that we are trying to say is the enrichment of language, having a very rich language, would lead us to have richer experiences, and not vice versa. Like, we don't have something out that is we couldn't describe, and then language accommodates that, right? So the starting point of having better grasping into everything is language, is not phenomenon. Or I'm getting things wrong.
Well, I mean, it's going to be a long way into the process of our brains using language to create more affordances in the world before we get to anything like inferential role semantics. I'm just not quite understanding the part of sellers you want to pick up on. You're saying, look, there's this, I don't know, richer vein or more interesting or enriched kind of experience we have once we have a sophisticated language, and that we can't have that until the language is there for us. Is that your thought?
It's I do remember this idea from sellers that he talks about our inner episodes, our feelings, let's say. It's not like, okay, I feel this feeling, but it doesn't seem my language have a word for this feeling, but I feel it. For sellers, no, you don't feel what you feel
Yeah.
without language telling you what are you feeling. So
Yeah.
language is kind of, it's not just mirroring your feeling or giving you a way to express it. It's more of, it's creating your own feeling.
Yeah,
So-
yeah. So, I mean, this isn't certainly within individuals and human development, and you'll even I mean, I remember this one example from this summer with my um nephew, little guy. I can't remember what he did. He did something he wasn't supposed to do, and there are lots of family around, so we tried not to pick on him and really sort of draw attention out. But later he was like, I have a tummy ache. I don't know why, but my stomach hurts. And then his dad said, you know what that is? You're feeling guilty about having done that thing to your sister before. And who knows if that's what it was? But that was part of his training to be a better behavior better behavior, a better actor, a better agent in a social situation. Was we wanted him we wanted him to feel guilty, and then he had a feeling, and maybe it's that, right? And so that one of the examples that Dennett has in this thing is the difference between what is it? Embarrassment and shame or something. And you know, and these things are differentiated, and different cultures put different lines on what those are. Famously, we in the Arab world, we live in a culture that emphasizes shame to an extent that's much more than in some other cultures. So uh, different things get um, emphasized. Yeah, and language. Yeah. So I'm not. I think that part of the developmental psychology that you're picking up on, I don't know whether it comes from Sellers or not, but yeah, that's certainly there. That we need, yeah, okay, yeah, and this is important too. When you have these people who, for various reasons, end up completely isolated for the first 2, 3 years of their life, they never developed a capacity for full language use. Now, which way does that count? Which way does that count as evidence for? Their brains seem not to have developed a capacity to receive. I don't know. This is all heavy stuff. But anyway, good. Yeah, this is the stuff I want to think about. Okay, let's Hassan. Okay, language evolved to fit the brain before the brain evolved to better accommodate language. Okay, we've learned from developmental linguistics that children acquire the semantics with almost no instruction. Doting parents in most cultures love to teach their children the names for things, but however enthusiastic they are about this subject, their children acquire the meanings of most of their words gradually without explicit attention and without any deliberate parental guidance. Repeated exposure to thousands of words in context provides almost all the information needed to come to a reliable sense of what they must mean. Requiring a little fine tuning is an occasion later on. Is a pony a kind of horse? Is a fox a dog? Oh, am I ashamed or embarrassed? I keep thinking just a little bit. So yeah, okay. So yeah, that's the idea. And by the way, just for real world application of this stuff, it's now that one of the reasons for the developmental defects in that generation that should have been going to school during COVID, just starting, like kindergarten, first grade, all that. The one of the problems they're having is they didn't have this cacophony of input of language. Maybe they were watching stuff on, but they probably weren't watching thing on their iPads or whatever. They probably weren't watching the complexity of things that happen just when you're around with your parents and their friends are talking about whatever. They heard from their parents. They might have heard some media sources, but they missed out on that huge data exposure that people build up from. So that's just one of the cases where this seems to really have been proven out. Okay, good. So that is that. Okay. They don't need instruction. Their brains are sort of yeah. Okay. The part about Socrates' paradox of recollection is interesting. I'm going to try to do fairness to this. So I think it's in. I think it's in the Meno. But you know this one where he does this demonstration and this totally like racist classist thing. He has a slave boy come up and says, "Can you demonstrate this geometrical proof?" And they go, "Oh yeah, look at the dumb slave kid can do it." And he concludes that all knowledge is recollection. And this is part of how he builds up to the forms. That the knowledge has always been there. We just have to come in contact with it. Why did Socrates, smart guy, end up with a view like that? And it's okay. So Socrates was puzzled about the fact that people could figure out a definition of a word just by talking it over with each other. And when you think about it, that's how all the Socratic dialogues proceed, right? He sits there in the Republic, he says, "What is justice?" In other ones, he says, "What is piety? What is this? What is that?" And then people sort of work on it, and then they fine tune it. Okay, here's a very using formal, very sort of explicit logic to state the paradox. Here it is. If one knows, inquiry of the known is unnecessary, right? So if you already know what a word means or what the geometric proof is, you don't need to do an inquiry. And if you don't know, inquiry of the unknown is impossible. Therefore, inquiry is either unnecessary or impossible. In order to get to his conclusion about all knowledge is recollection, which of the two horns of this dilemma does Socrates bite on? You following me? Is inquiry impossible or unnecessary on his view? So the idea is,
Impossible, no?
remember, his conclusion is going to be all knowledge is recollection from previous generations or something, right? It's not. So thank you for taking a crack, but it's going to go the other way. Yeah. Socrates' theory of recollection arises as a response to this dilemma. Oh, okay. So he says, look, it's weird. Why do these people just sort of have this conversation and then in that sense, right. I'm sorry, Pia. You're right. In that sense, it is impossible. One doesn't need to do inquiry on their own. The idea is that if you just get these people talking, then the definition will appear. Okay. So part of the dissolution of the conundrum, because Dennett thinks Socrates is engaged in a false dichotomy here. It isn't that it's either unknown or known. The dissolution of this conundrum is the recognition that understanding a word is not the same thing as having acquired a definition of it, right? And that's the whole thing. I mean, that's what you think about and why Socrates annoyed people. Everyone felt like they were perfectly competent at using these words: piety, justice, truth, or knowledge. That was the other one, justified true belief. Everyone felt they were perfectly competent using this. Well, Socrates, what do you mean? You're gonna have to give us a definition. We're gonna come up with a definition. So it's understanding a term is not the same thing as having acquired a definition of it. And we've all had this experience, right? You're reading along and you get something by the context and you're fully capable of using it. And then when you really say, oh, wait a minute, is that different from this term or that term? And then you look it up in the dictionary and you're like, oh, I get it. Okay. So moving on to page 197, there's an interesting discussion about the domestication of dogs that helps set up some important points about human infants, right? So that discussion goes like this. So there was this idea, it's just kind of a myth, right? The thought of, well, how was it that, dogs just didn't appear? They're clearly very closely related to wolves and foxes and those kind of animals. So what happened there? And so there's this kind of story that developed at some point in people thinking about this that's pretty cute, where like, people wanted companions. And so they went and snuck into the den of wolves and stole a pup and then brought it to their community. And then they, sort of, I don't remember how I set this up. Yeah, the myth is humans turn wolves into dogs by deliberately snatching wild wolf pups from the dens and then teaching, I don't know, beating them into domestication. Mhm. And then what's the much more plausible story? And this is going to be another case of gradualism, right? Once human settlements began to generate concentrations of discarded edible food, right, including like bones that have marrow in them that our teeth really aren't very good at getting at, but it's there. Then that's the whole the thing about the classic image of the dog chewing on the bone. That's trying to get at the marrow that human teeth aren't very good at getting at. These dumps became attractive to wild wolves who varied initially in their ability to tolerate the proximity to dangerous human beings. Those who could bear to be that close became geographically and reproductively isolated from their more wary cousins who kept their distance. And what emerged over time was the junkyard dog. That's a bad analogy because junkyard dogs actually are owned by one guy and it protects their junk anyway. Belonging to nobody, nobody's pet or companion, but a familiar presence in the community, like house mice, rats, squirrels. Dogs, in effect, domesticated themselves, and this again is supposed to be like the way words do it. Dogs, in effect, domesticated themselves over many generations until their human neighbors became their owners, their companions, their guardians, their masters. Right? Now, I take it's pretty plausible that that second story is more likely to be how it went than the first. And there's lots of places where you can see varieties of this. I spent 3 months in the coast of Costa Rica, the seaside of Costa Rica, and there are dogs there that are feral. They're no longer kept by anybody, and they just kind of come down to when the fishermen come in at the end of the afternoon, and as they clean the fish, take out the skeleton, and throw the dogs eat the skeletons and the eyes and the tails and the other stuff that people don't want, and people pretty much tolerate them, but then they'll chase them away afterwards because they're just these dirty skunky dogs. So that kind of phenomenon is an ongoing one. But the idea, and this is, I know there's a lot of hard stuff to think about in this chapter. The idea is that language or modes of communication did something like that in order to be useful for hosts like our brains. Okay. Oh, yeah, this will work. I just want kind of thing happen. Like, what's wrong with his leg? Does it hurt? No, he's bending down to drink out of the puddle. Okay, that's one. And there's this one too, which is really neat. So here comes the pickup truck to the intersection, and the truck says, "I don't want to hit this thing. I'll let it go."
I don't think we can see anything if you're trying to show us.
Yeah,
Oh, why isn't it working like? Oh, because it's not maximized for images. Okay. Darn it, that was really fun. So, they're very
Um,
short, so I can just explain. The first one, this
you
moose in a town
can,
in Alaska
sorry,
comes along. What?
you can send links on the chat if you have them.
I think I just closed the damn thing.
Okay.
I'll send. I'll send him after class. So basically, here this guy's walking around in this Alaska town, this moose, and it looks like his legs are hurt or something, or he's got him bent over so he can put him like this, so he can lean down and drink out of a puddle. That's the first one. Like, okay, so it's adapted to getting water the way that it lies around in human communities. But the next one, the guy's just sitting there filming, but the moose is walking down the road, and then a pickup truck comes the other way, and there's an intersection, like a proper intersection with lights and zebra stripes for making, and and the guy driving the truck's like, I don't want to hit this moose, so he stops, and before that, the moose is kind of waiting at his intersection where the zebra stripe is for the pedestrians. He's waiting, and then the guy in the camera says, "Go ahead, the truck's stopping, you can go." And then the moose goes across the street. So it's learned this rudimentary thing that when you come, I don't know whether it knows the intersection, but anyway, when you get near a vehicle, pay attention. If it stops, then you can probably continue to walk, right? So, and the reason why the moose is there is, hey, there's that water, but also, they do the same things that those dogs did. They're looking for, heads of lettuce by the grocery store that they toss out because they're no longer nice enough looking that people will buy them. Anyway, so that was just another example of these animals sort of figuring out how to get along with us, and then preparing themselves for functioning in the way our towns work, as opposed to us preparing our towns for them. Okay. And again, this is all supposed to tie back into an analogy of that these units of information, that's what we should call them instead of words or language, that these units of information evolve to fit into our brains and our community in ways that are analogous to the dog and the moose. Okay. Similarly, we can imagine, so now we got to think of the moose as like a baby. Similarly, we can imagine it only gradually dawns on infants that they have all these words they can start to use. Indeed, they start using them and enjoying the benefits of using them long before they realize what they are doing. Eventually, they reach a point where the words in their manifest image become their own words, right? Now, then it builds up an analogy with human domestication of animals, like basically animal husbandry, farming. It starts with fairly random willy-nilly, he calls it, and then transitions to goal-directed sorts of work that horse breeders and cattlemen do. So, right. So you move from just trying to get an animal that's docile enough to stay near humans without running away. That's the first step of domesticating a cow from a water buffalo. But then eventually you're like, well, let's see if we can get one that will develop lots of weight within 3 years, so we have to spend less time feeding it before we can use it for something to sell. Okay. And then here's back to this analogy with words. In the domestication of words, this emerges when individuals become reflexive or self-conscious about their use of language, shunning words they find unimpressive or offensive or old-fashioned or too slangy and new. So here's the idea. As normal members of a human community, there's words just pouring into us because we're listening and people are saying things to us, expecting us to react, and we don't know what's going on. And then we start to notice some things, right? That like if you say this, you get some advantage, some of that. And then eventually, as we get older, we start to stylize and tweak it, right? And we move from the person who just wants the cow that will stay close enough to saying, oh, let's get a particular developmental system of cow that will be commercially viable. And he says that's how it works with people. So again, organisms functioning, moving into a community is analogous to words functioning and coming into a community. Okay. Now there's this. Okay, I'm on the last 2 pages of my notes. We can just press on here. Okay, now the phonemes discussion. Phonemes are not just a brilliant way of organizing auditory stimuli for reliable transmission. They're also a kind of benign illusion, like the ingenious user illusion of the click and drag icons, little tan folders into which files may be dropped, and the rest of the ever more familiar items on your computer's desktop. Nothing compact and salient inside the computer responds to the little tan folder on the desktop screen. And nothing compact and salient can be discerned among the physical properties of different occurrences of the phonemes that distinguish cat from bat, from bad from bed, and ball from bill, and fall from fill. The differences between those words seem simple and obvious, but this is an illusion engendered by our inbuilt competence, not any underlying simplicity in the signal. And, you know, I mean, talked about examples of this. I still, because I started to encounter the phonemes too late, I still can't say the Arabic male name that gets Latinized A-L-A-A, and sometimes with a little apostrophe to him. I still can't say that without it sounding like the Arabic word for God, which is awkward in classes when you say God. Do you know the answer to this question? So, because I can't discern the phoneme. It seems obvious to y'all the difference between the word for God and the word for that male name, but I just can't hear it because I don't have that phoneme distinguisher. So that's the idea. Those other words for somebody who, especially from a language like Japanese, coming in to try to be an English speaker, are super hard to distinguish between. So that's just an example. We have an incredible amount of competences to be able to reliably replicate the words that are being said to us. And if we didn't acquire those, then those words would die out. So the words have to kind of make a environment in our brains in which they can survive. All right. Okay, he notes that speech recognition software has recently, finally gotten almost as good as a normal 5-year-old at extracting the phonemes of casual speech. But note this, the digitization of phonemes, that's what you need in order to set up speech recognition software. The digitization of phonemes has a profound implication. Words play a role in cultural evolution that is similar to the role of DNA in genetic evolution, but unlike physically identified ladder rings in the double helix, etc., words are not physically identical replicators, right? They're not the tokens, the type words are not physical at all, and we need these phonemes in order to make even the tokens reliable or accurately replicated. Okay. After comparing humans to chimpanzees in captivity, he's just saying, if you think about if chimpanzees had even a tenth of our capacity to understand language, the ones that live in zoos their whole life, if they could just figure out a little bit of what the zookeepers are saying, they could very easily figure out ways to escape or to get more food that they want or to do whatever. But they don't. Their brains aren't set up like that. Words are affordances that our brains are designed by evolutionary processes to pick up. As Gibson said, and they afford all manner of uses. So at the end of this, in the notion of the revolution of words, and it's a little bit more about words, we need the distinction between tokens and types, and the notion that types are not physical, although the tokens are physically instantiatable. And there's no analog in the brain for the code that passes along that gives us the type that we then use to token. There's no analog for a physical thing there. It's just not the way it works. And words are affordance that our brains are designed by evolutionary processes. And by the way, you can tell from that he's actually muddying the water a bit on that distinction about whether evolution designed to fit our brains or our brains designed to fit evolution. The answer is both, like it is in so many of his cases. That's in this really complicated chapter. That's what I understood from it, and I tried to press some questions that I thought you all would find interesting and worth thinking about. Let me know what you're thinking at this point. So that's the idea. He's trying to build up a explanatory paradigm. No, here I missed. Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah. That's sort of what we were coming to. Okay. Questions, comments, thoughts? Well, I mean, what do you think? I mean, this is where we've been building up to this for a little bit. We talked a lot about this sort of different relationship between these explanatory paradigms, but this is where we're first seeing the first traction, where he's trying to apply this model of evolutionary development to a cultural phenomenon. We're not all the way to culture, but we're to a very important part of culture: language and words. Reem, did I talk over you? You had your mic off for us. You had your
Yes,
unmute off for us. Okay, go ahead.
but it's the point you mentioned earlier about consciousness. Because I'm
Yeah.
still trying to make sense of Dennett's view on consciousness. So he's saying that we shouldn't opt for the option of all or nothing about consciousness. But in my view previously, I thought he said that basically everything is unconscious in some sort of way and there is no intentionality and everything else he claimed as being random. So is he saying there's some sort of consciousness, just not the way we think of consciousness? Rather, it's like natural selection and cultural evolution consciousness. Sorry if I didn't make sense.
Remember, he's probably his best-selling book is called Consciousness Explains. He certainly thinks that human beings, one of the things that human beings have is consciousness. He thinks a lot of people have false ideas about what it is. So, and some people will say, I mean, one of the first really important reviews of Consciousness Explained was Consciousness Explained Away, that this isn't giving us what we thought we wanted when we're talking about consciousness. But yeah, no, he thinks that the words that we use and various ideas that we have intentionality. There is intentionality, but he's that has to be built up from non-intentional stuff. It's kind of an emergent property. And that's the tricky bit where some people just say, look, it's different in kind. It's nothing like anything. And this is what Brentano said. He says it's the mark of the mental. The human mind has this, on the planet, this unique capacity to have, I don't know what you want to call them. I guess I'll just have to call them thoughts, represent other situations external to us out in the world to ourselves, right? We have intentionality, we have representation. And he said, that's just this unique thing humans have, and it's different in kind. And Dennis says, no, it's not different in kind, it's in degree. There's proto-intentionality in, the dog who looks around. When the dog's chasing the squirrel, the squirrel runs behind the tree and the dog looks to see if it's there. There's a kind of intentionality there. It's just not conceptual or linguistic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I think it
Yeah.
makes, I'm starting to wrap my head about it.
Yeah. And this is really one of the trickiest bits. I believe the book gets less confusing, but it is frustrating. It is difficult, but it's because he's trying to set out an as yet unexplored research paradigm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and when we finish this book in a couple of weeks, we'll look at some articles that try to execute particular parts of this research paradigm that he's suggesting. Okay.
All right, deal.
Yeah. And so, Mohammed, did you get the readings for next week? Were chapters 10 and 11? We talked about that before you joined, I think.
No, I did.
Okay. I used to be good about always sending you guys emails, but I keep forgetting. So listen, this time we did 10. We're going to do 2 chapters. One, a very short chapter called The Memes I Point of View, chapter 10. And then chapter 11, which is a sort of a much more classic philosophical structure to an article, less speculatory for this. He says, what's wrong with memes, objections and replies. So he's going to talk a little bit about this idea that he and Richard Dawkins co-developed, memes, and then he's going to look at a whole series of objections that people have pressed to it and said, look, this idea of memes is not really useful. And again, it's I don't know if this was inaccessible, but it was tricky because he's trying to stretch these terms in ways that are very hard to keep track of what's going on. But there'll be less of that in the next 2 sections. So hopefully that will go well. Okay. I believe that's all I have for today.
Can we stay a bit after because I want to discuss the paper?
Yeah. I got nowhere to go. And again, Mohammed in particular, because Ali and Riyam I've already talked to, but when you have an idea, just ask me and let's set up a time to have a conversation. Or if you want to show me an outline, yeah, again. Okay, good. So I guess for Ali, Reem, and Mohammed, that's it for today. And I will now talk to Pia about her paper. Goodbye, guys.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Okay. So first of all, this is like a separate paper from the final one, right? There's 2 papers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. But I was just talking to. I haven't talked to Ali about his proposal, but I think Reem is going to do one of the models I talked about before. With this, she's working on. I don't remember the details, but the first one she's going to do is just pure exegesis, no real philosophical analysis. She's going to basically say, look, here's what homuncular functionalism is. Here's where, and then it says, I used to defend homuncular functionalism, but now I've changed my mind pretty much. So, and she's going to use Bill Lycan's book, Consciousness, to get that. She's just going to say, look, here's what homuncular functionalism is. Here's the reasons that Lycan and old Dennett used to hold it. And here's the reasons why new Dennett rejects it. And that
Okay.
will just be exegesis. And then at the end of the semester, she'll do, a more proper one where she'll use that as the basis and then say, okay, now I'm going to have to stand up on my own hind legs and take a philosopher's stance and say, this is the position that's right, and here's why. So there's
Okay.
any number of models. So you can either do it
Um,
as 2 entirely separate ones, or you can do them as stage 1 of a longer project.
Okay, I was gonna stick to the first topic that we discussed, which is like semantic characterization. Yep. And I wanted to ask you, like, okay, so my basic intuition is that semantic information is kind of a function of the token. So it's basically what we've been discussing, or actually we haven't discussed them directly, but just as pain, let's say, is a function of like a certain nerves within the human brain, and it could be like pain but run through the nerves of a cat, like it would be a different, or like a robot or whatever. But I think I'm
Yeah,
getting ahead of
different
myself.
instantia. It's multiply realizable. It's a different.
Yeah.
It's realized within a different substance.
Okay, so my like the first premise is that meaning is sort of like that, and what you discussed today about like the different token types, so it could be sign language, it could be, well, not binary, but the system that we use to represent the meaning could be different. And when it comes to characterization, could like intentionality be a character of meaning? Like that's what I wanted to ask you essentially. Like, is intentionality something I can use to characterize?
Well, okay, standardly, I'm trying to think back to the last time I went through. Standardly, it's a not exactly a synonym, but definitely analogous. That in the philosophy of language and linguistics, they talk about meaning and semantics, and in philosophy of mind, they talk about intentionality. So they're sort of two different approaches to the same phenomenon. Because
Okay.
they both have to do with the relationship between something mental or something linguistic, and the debate about where that line is between language and mind is a whole other thing. But um, something mental / linguistic in some state of affairs out in the world. Both
Okay.
intentionality and semantics are getting at that. Okay.
Okay. So yeah, it can't be used. Okay. So yeah, I guess here's where my problem is. I'm not sure what a characteristic of meaning could be, but I think that would be the paper. Like that's the challenge. But when it comes to what I discussed before that regarding it being a function of, does that make any sense?
Being a function, you gave the example of pain, and
Yeah, I mean, like meaning being a sort of software that you run on these different tokens.
okay, so his notion of he's got a very, because later in this chapter he mentions, oh, by the way, I'm using semantic in the more traditional sense, not the sense I was talking about back in there. So it's a very broad sense in what she's talking about. Is just now okay, so his worry, and this was running throughout the discussion today, his worry is like, look, it was really great for
Hold on, you're coming
genetic.
off just a sec. One sec.
Let's try turning video off.
Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay. Okay. Where were we?
His like the way he uses semantic, semantic meaning. Semantics.
Oh, so what he was getting at there was when you talk about, well, what would a characteristic or what would a characterization of it be? The contrast case is with genetics, where we had us for hundreds of years. People had a sense that traits were inherited from parents to offspring, and that's a sequential thing, right? And then it turns out that in the 20th century, Crick and somebody else found the physical characterization of that it's these double helix codes. I don't know all the biological terms. It's proteins replicate that, and it replicates a particular way, and that gave him a deeper understanding of how mutations happen. It's when the replication gets there's an error in it, and then you have a mutation. Most times mutations are better, right? But and he was saying, it would be great if there was something like that for semantics, where we understand that it's important for the human development, and we need to know how, we need to have an account of how people go about grabbing information in the world that helps them find affordances. But he's suspicious that, or he's doubtful that we can ever find something analogous to that genetic information, the double helix and the DNA. So he was saying, if we did, we could do this as straight science, but this is going to have to, in the end of the day, be something else, where we've got,
Right.
and the fact that you picked up on the type token thing is good, because that's what he's saying. He's like, look, we've got these tokens. Nope, I said it wrong. We've got these types that seem abstract, and maybe even the right thing to say is they're not physical. They're bound up in social conventions or norms or something like that.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. But
Doesn't, yeah.
go ahead.
I mean, no, continue. Sorry.
No, I really didn't. I was kind of hemming.
Isn't, like, again, this might be extremely dumb because I'm trying to verify whether I understand what's going on.
It's all fine.
But can't words be like the sort of DNA for semantics? Or again, just like tokens, if we don't want to limit ourselves to words as we know them.
Yeah, and I mean, this is what Chomsky and those guys in the '60s were trying to get with the notion of a universal grammar, right? So one of the things that the universal grammar was supposed to explain is this thing that they call the paucity of stimulus, right? Like, how do kids end up not only learning words but understanding how to put them together into sentences that are grammatically correct? Because my daughter's now in college and she's taking Latin, and she's like, wow, in all the languages I've studied, including my mother tongue, English, nobody ever said, this is what declension comes down to, and this is how adverbial phrases are different than adjectival phrases, that we don't study grammar in that way, but kids learn it. And so often from parents, they just think about relatively uneducated people. Parents don't know the rules of syntax, and so Chomsky posited a universal syntax, a universal grammar that everybody has, no matter what language you speak. It's just it's in there, and that you plug in a type, and then because you've got this grammatical structure in your brain, how to put tokens of that into sentences properly, right? So you don't end up saying things like the big is on the table, right? Because big is an adjective and you need a noun there. And how do we acquire that, right? And so that's why they said, well, maybe there's just sort of this built-in thing. Yeah. So, and I agree with you that when he starts talking about word types and word tokens, it sort of sounds like it's the tokenings that have the semantic in it, and the types are something different, right? So this idea, right, where he said, look, kids are going to have to fine tune it sometime, and you have to ask, is a pony a kind of a horse, or is it something different, right? All kinds of words, we acquire the type of it, right? Like
Yeah.
I remember, and then you go around and you have to try to figure out whether when you do a token instance of it, you have to figure out whether or not that matches up correctly. And somebody points out, no, that's not a mammal. Look, it lays eggs and has webbed feet. And then you had this
Mhm.
debate about whether duck-tailed platypus. Yeah, that and you know, and I don't think it's he was putting that out there as like a as an open-ended question. He's very skeptical that we'll ever end up with a characterization, but he's not saying it's impossible. So I think it could definitely be done, even if it's a, almost just a first draft, or not a first draft in the sense of a paper, but a first attempt at saying at doing this. I think trying to build up a characterization of semantics in terms of, say, the type token distinction could be fruitful.
Okay. So I shouldn't drop it.
No, I think
Um,
it'd be interesting to try. And don't be afraid to think of this like a scientist, right? Where if you
mm,
start a project and say, "Here is my attempt to try to get a characterization," and if in the end you say, "Huh, it looks like it's not going to work," that's not like an incomplete paper. It's just, you know, I'm all for this. I'm an empiricist and I'm a naturalist. I'm all for doing philosophy in the same way that engineers and scientists think, right? So you say, here's a proposal. Can I put together the conceptual tools that are necessary to get this kind of characterization? Because you might, I could think of a kind of thing where you might say, like, look, here's 3 different candidates. Here's the weaknesses of them. Here's the strength of them. And then famously, you'll see this in articles all the time. They'll say, "I leave this issue to be explored by other theorists." They're like, "I
yeah.
couldn't figure it out." No, this could be okay.
Okay.
That could be a very cool paper.
Okay. W- Going back to functionalism,
Yeah.
could that be one of the attempts? Because for me, I feel like meaning is again a representation that is done through a certain medium. So it's not, I don't actually think like it's like a type that is like that we have tokens for. I think it's again some sort of representation of something that is put through a certain medium, whether it's uh, like the types of languages that we mentioned. Could that
Well,
be something useful?
mm, okay. So one of the things that people thought was interesting and helpful about functionalism when it came along was it sort of bracketed the question of what the medium is, right? This was the idea, like, it doesn't matter if we're talking about a computer, it doesn't matter if we're talking about a human being, it doesn't matter if we're talking about a Martian. As long as you sort of fulfill or satisfy the functional architecture, uh, uh, then you're doing it, and you're meaning. You have intentionality. That was sort of the original insight of functionalism. So, um, but I just don't know what you're thinking yet in terms of why emphasizing that it's. Is your idea that looking at what it's physically instantiated in will help with the characterization, or what's the thought there?
Um, yeah, it's sort of like this idea that again, meaning is different from the, what did he call it again? Like the physical word
Yeah.
or like yeah, it's like trying to sort through like this
Meaning,
dualistic
so so
approach.
so Dennis got this 3 level thing where there's the physical stance, the design stance, and the intentional stance, and meaning lives at the intentional stance. And then what you're talking about is, well, it's gonna whatever the bearers of meanings are, whether they're words or inferential relations or whatever, they're going to have to be instantiated in the design and physical stances, right? So unless we're Cartesians and we say, well, it's instantiated in some sort of mysterious ghost stuff. Yeah. So yeah, I guess I'm struggling a little bit with the same thing you were struggling with right at the beginning with what is it going to amount to call it a characterization, right?
Okay, yeah.
No, I'm just wondering what are you thinking?
I'm struggling with it, honestly.
No, no, but me too. That doesn't mean it won't be interesting. It just means
Okay. Can you repeat your question?
okay. So again, let's go back between the analogy with genetics. So Dennett says when we have the notion of a gene that is selected for and passes from generation to generation unless it mutates, we have a characterization of that that is the double helix in the DNA. Again, I don't know the right words, I'm sorry, but DNA. And he says, I don't think we're going to find something like that for meaning, for semantics, for semantic information. And your thought is, look, we can take the first steps at finding something. So, but that's weird. That yeah. So I see what now I see where you're getting this notion of instantiation from, right? You're saying like, look, the genetic when we talk about genetics at the level of heritable traits and noticing that I bet that guy those guys are brothers because they both have the same color blue eyes or whatever, right? That gets instantiated in your term in the physical genetic code, and that isn't there some kind of a relationship like that in when we say, well,
Between words and their meaning, like
oh, words and their meaning, okay, words and their meaning, words and their meaning, yeah, right, and right, because we certainly right, and remember this other thing he said, look, knowing how to use a word is different than having a definition of it. We acquire a word and then there's a couple other things going on, right? We need to learn how to use it and we get corrected, right? Where you point to like a big dog as a kid, right? You point to a big dog and say, Dad, is that a horse? He said, no, it's a Doberman Pinscher. It's a big dog. It's not a little horse. And you refine your capacity to use. I'm going to go ahead and use the term you don't like, but you refine your capacities to do tokenings appropriately, and then later you might find a reason to look it up in a dictionary and actually get the lexical definition of it. And that's a kind of meaning. Oh, another thing that might be useful, now that you mention this, is to look at the different kinds of meanings or definitions that people think there are. Because there's all kinds. There's 5 different ones. I'll find the relevant bit of. So basically, we have there's theoretical definitions where you say what I'm tired. Where basically scientific concepts are often theoretical definitions where you say mass is shoot, I can't remember. You probably know better. So that, and then there's also precising ones, right? Too, where in legal contexts where somebody will say, I have a right to privacy, and then somebody says, well, the police pulled me over and they looked in my trunk and they found this thing I didn't want them to know I had. Don't I have a right to privacy? And then the courts need to figure out whether or not your right to privacy includes or covers your motor vehicle, right? And so that's a precising definition. And there's and the only one that we've talked about so far is a lexical one, which is just where words exist in a culture, and then the dictionary makers or the lexicographer's job is to try to as best they can, get a sense for what the word is being used at now. Oh, and meme is an example of I think it's called prescriptive, where people just make something up. Dennett and Dawkins were like, we need some way to talk about the way we were applying evolutionary thinking to cultural, or else like, well, let's call words and ideas memes because it sounds like gene and people remember it, right? That's another kind
Yeah.
of definition. But I'm not sure that'll be helpful. It's just I'm thinking out loud now because I'm just trying to give shape to your project. Hey, never mind. I'll think about that some more. If I think you should pursue it, I'll press it, but I don't think so.
Okay.
Um,
So the deadline for this is 1st of November?
yeah.
Okay. I will try. If I fail, I'll submit that anyway.
Yeah. And then it's fine.
Okay.
Look, this semester is the art of the possible. Obviously, we're all dealing with just so many distractions, and you're not going to have the normal amount of focus you could. And the fact that these conversations on this material happen so slowly because we're doing it online, all of it. The fact that it's hard to get to Jaffa and just sort of pull books out that are relevant, all of it. So I'll be again. My goal at the end of this is between it in two paper structures, have one thing that has some possibility of being worked into something that you might submit for review on in a different context, in a different application, in an
Yeah. No, it's
application.
because it's because like maybe for the end of the semester it might be like I would have more time. But
Yeah.
for the 1st of November, I don't think I would pull together something like,
Well, this is very
polished.
this is a very ambitious project you're doing. I mean, the other sorts of things are easier to get in and out of efficiently. I mean, but for instance, one of the things there's a lot of paper topics will present themselves in chapters 10 and 11 where he says, look, these are objections people have made to my view. And you might think, oh, I think Dennett's response here is really interesting. I could say more about that. Or you could say, nah, Dennett's wrong. And that's a much more traditional kind of philosophy paper. Position, objection, response. And then you've got that raw material from him, and then you can say, well, what is there something more that's interesting to be said here? You might. Yeah,
I could,
I
but I
didn't want
think
to discourage you. I didn't want to discourage you from doing so. And what are the other ones that we've talked about? Oh, when that was something that came up in another context. Have you had a chance yet to take a look at okay. I try to adjudicate some of the disputes about this idea that Dennett's trying to discourage us from taking seriously that consciousness is this unique property that only human minds have, and intentionality, by the way, because these other philosophers think intentionality is a subspecies of consciousness, right? Because they're going to say no, dogs don't have intentionality. Intentionality is all the other. So I try to adjudicate some of that dispute and argue kind of on Dennett's behalf in that chapter I sent you guys. Intentionality and
yeah.
so that could also be a place to look. Yeah, to be honest,
Okay.
I think I like this topic you're talking about. It seems very interesting, but it is very open-ended and ambitious, and you might end up finding it kind of frustrating to try to do it in 2.5
That's
weeks.
okay. That's okay. I think I'm okay with that.
Yeah,
And I already started thinking about it. So
yeah, no, good, yeah, good.
if I
And I noticed other things came up, but when you say, "Oh, there's this stuff," yeah, good, fine. So put that aside. Go ahead, do it. And like I said, feel free to take Dennett's advice and look at it like you're a scientist, and a no result that is, oh, my hypothesis wasn't supported by the evidence that I found, or by the exercise that I went through in trying to develop my hypothesis. Just we'll consider that progress, right? This is how progress is made in intellectual pursuits in general, and I think philosophy has done better since the 1920s, 1930s, when people started to try to say, look, we're really an extension of what the physical sciences are doing. We shouldn't think, you know, I mean, to be flippant about it, we shouldn't spend our time arguing about how many angels can stand on the head of a pin, because we're never going to make progress on that. But yeah, taking a shot at coming up with a characterization of, and then saying like, kind of just doesn't work, and here's the reasons. But and again, another model might be if you have one or two different suggestions that work and sort of compare what the strengths and weaknesses of the two are, something like that. But yeah, you can do a good job with it, I'm sure. Yeah, I like the fact you're not afraid. That's cool.
Okay, thank you. One last question. How long should the paper be technically?
I'm gonna say something frustrating. I don't care.
Okay. No,
I
no,
think
that's okay. I was just.
I think a good thing to aim for is something like 6 or 7 pages. You know, double space, 12 font.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Got
and then
you.
because
Oh,
and then that will either be that's a fine standalone, and then you can do another one, or it can be like the first half of a more ambitious paper for the final one of the semester. Yeah,
okay.
but you
Got
know,
you.
so I know Ali's going to give me 25 pages. That's just how he rolls. But I but yeah, it's different. I really just you know I published one paper that was literally 3 pages long, and it's maybe the best thing I
Okay.
published. I published another one that was 25 pages long. So
It will
whatever,
depend.
yeah, whatever you need to make your point.
Okay, understood. True.
Thank you. Have a good day, and I'll talk to you later.
Too. Take care. Bye.
Bye.